Good afternoon and welcome to today's webinar series on our Coping with COVID series. I'm Dr. Wendy Smeltzer, National Medical Director of Wello, which is our telemedicine program, and in Live, our medical facility in Calgary. So besides the medical aspects of this pandemic, we're also seeing a huge impact on businesses and workplaces. And today's webinar, we've got an incredible panel of professionals who will give us information and advice on how to navigate some of these business challenges, such as managing employee engagement and legalities during these times, and a look at some of the government programs out there. So we have two lawyers on our panel today, one with expertise in public and political law, another with expertise in employment law. We have a business leader and an HR specialist who will all share their knowledge with us today. We'll have each of them present some of the highlights of some of their insights, and then we'll open for questions at the end. So we're going to start with our first panelist, Alexis Levine. Alexis is a partner at Blake, Cassels and Graydon LLP, and he's the leader of the public and political law practice in the firm. He's been a strategic advisor to a number of senior federal, provincial, and municipal politicians of Canada. He's an adjunct professor of government decision-making at Osgoode Hall Law School, and he routinely gives advice to businesses navigating public and political law issues and government decision-making. So I'll turn it over to you now, Alexis. We look forward to your comments.
Great. Well, thank you for that. And let me just reinforce that we're really going to be focused, Birch and myself, on businesses trying to navigate this pandemic and the measures that the federal and provincial governments have put in place. My partner Birch is going to speak more fully to employment matters in a moment, and frankly I think she'll be more interesting than what I have to say. There are a couple of hundred programs that have been announced across the country to help specific groups, industries, and individuals navigate this. And we're not going to be able to cover all of that in the course of today. What I am going to do is give a sense of some of the most important programs and some of the buckets that of programs that are out there and places where you may decide you want to look for more information. So I'll start by mentioning the legislation that was passed over the weekend, which I'm sure Birch will touch on as well. This is the Canadian Emergency Wage Subsidy, the 75% wage subsidy up to $847 per week per employee, that's available to businesses that have suffered a revenue decline as a result of COVID. That decline is 15% in March 2020 versus a comparative period, and that comparative period is usually March 2019 or the average of January, February 2020. And it's available to cover the that wage of Canadian employees. That's a very important measure that we're hearing from businesses across the country that are impacted by this pandemic. In addition to the Canada Emergency Wage Subsidy, there are a number of other programs that are out there for Canadian businesses, and I'm not going to dwell on the CEWS because Birch will touch on it, and because there is so much other information out there about it, I am going to try and flag a couple of other points for you. The first bucket that I want to speak to is tax measures that are being put in place for businesses. So taxes that are due or that become due between mid-March and August 31st are deferred until September 1st. So are tax enforcement measures. That's the federal measure. There are comparable approaches being taken by most other provincial and territorial jurisdictions. That gives flexibility in terms of paying taxes and also in terms of worrying about filing for those taxes over the next few months. You should, of course, consult with your tax advisor on exactly what your timing and filing plan is going to be, and that does not apply in every case to every business. So, for example, trusts have earlier timelines, but there is increased flexibility on tax. There are also tax deferrals to June 30th for monthly filers of GST, HST, which is a significant deferral. And we've seen at the provincial level a number of deferrals. So, for example, in the Ontario level, they've expanded the employer payroll health tax exemption to 57,000 additional employers. And there are deferrals of things like workplace safety and insurance board payments, which are significant for a number of industrial businesses. Those can be deferred as well. Beyond the tax measures, which are significant for a number of businesses, there are also some priority procurement measures that are being put in place. These are for businesses that either produce or are capable of producing priority products or delivering services that are a priority. There are obvious things here like protective gear and ventilators, but also less obvious things such as cleaning services, laundry services, catering services, which the government is looking for in order to be able to respond appropriately where they have healthcare needs. Those priority items are listed on the Government of Canada's buyandsell.gc.ca website. And for folks who either produce or may be able to retool to produce those products, they should look there. There's also changes to Canada's Patent Act and Canada's Food and Drug Act that allows production of patented products by someone who doesn't own the patent with the consent of the Minister of Health. And so there may be circumstances where folks have the ability to produce products that they were not producing because of patents and can get approval to produce those products and earn alternate revenue that way. The government's economic response plan includes a number of liquidity measures. The real approach here is for the Bank of Canada and the federal government to give liquidity in various shapes and sizes to financial institutions who will then give that liquidity to businesses. But there are a couple of direct measures. Of the liquidity measures, there's about $300 to $500 billion in liquidity measures, most of which is directed to existing financial institutions who then use that to fund existing and new commitments. But in addition to that, there is the Business Credit Availability Program and the Canada Emergency Business Account. The punchline is that for small and medium businesses, there are three liquidity measures that you should be aware of. The Canada Emergency Business Account is for the smallest businesses. That's the $40,000 interest-free loan repayable December 31st, 2022. If you repay it all by December 31st, 2022, $10,000 of the $40,000 is forgiven. So that's particularly useful for small businesses with payrolls of between 50,000 and $1 million, such as restaurants or retail stores. There's a $2 million working capital loan that is being provided by the Business Development Bank of Canada through private sector lenders. Again, to obtain that, you can reach out to BDC itself, but you can also reach out to your primary bank and ask them about that working capital loan. And they are working with BDC to deliver that. That's at fairly favorable pricing and fairly market favorable terms that's designed to provide working capital to businesses that need it. And then there is a $6.25 million loan guarantee program being launched by EDC. There's still a number of details on that program that are outstanding, EDC being Export Development Canada, but this program is available not just to exporters, but to others who are interested in obtaining it. And again, the idea is that EDC will provide a guarantee, but pair with a private sector lender who will actually provide the capital. Beyond those sorts of liquidity measures, there are other small business supports. So for example, to use Ontario as one example, there are supports that reduce power costs for small businesses and farmers. I've mentioned already the workplace safety and insurance board payments that are being deferred. There are also a number of industry-specific measures, and we are seeing more of these get rolled out, frankly, every few days. There is, for example, a measure for the aircraft industry deferring airport payments. There are measures for the broadcast industry that are deferring certain license fee payments. We are seeing announcements that folks who work in the tourism space can contact their regional federal economic development office for additional support. And we expect to continue to see a range of other industry-specific supports and measures, which may include supports and measures, for example, for the energy sector, or for other sectors that are particularly hard hit by this pandemic. And then I've already touched on the Canada Emergency Wage Subsidy. I should, of course, mention that there is, in addition to that, another 10% wage subsidy program that's available to a much smaller group of Canadian-controlled private corporations. If they don't qualify for the 75% wage subsidy, they may still qualify for this 10% wage subsidy. This was the prior program that's largely been supplanted by the new one, but is still available for employers who don't qualify for this new larger program. So I'm going to take a breath there, and I'm going to hand things over to Birch to talk about the situation for employers.
Great. Thanks, Alexis. Just to reintroduce myself here and start my video. There we go. So I am an employment and privacy lawyer. I work for Blake's, as mentioned by Alexis, and I work out of Calgary here. And I thought I would talk today about some of the employment and privacy questions we've been getting in the midst of this pandemic. So I'll just launch right in here. And of course, we won't be able to talk about all of the details, but I think this will trigger some of the questions and some of the concerns that employers in Canada have been facing. And of course, it depends on the jurisdiction you're in, but these are general categories. The first one I'm going to talk about that's not on the screen here in terms of the presentation is restrictions on workplaces. So several of the governments have announced the closure of non-essential businesses. Here in Alberta on March 27th, the Alberta government forced the closure of certain non-essential businesses, and for others that are not listed, implemented restrictions such as limits on groupings of more than 15 people and certain procedures in terms of hygiene. And then for essential services, there are also rules around that. So we have been advising on that front. On the occupational health and safety front, you know, a general duty that applies under occupational health and safety legislation is that our employers are required to protect the health and safety of their workers. And so this has resulted in a lot of discussion at first instance around measures to contain the spread of COVID, and this still applies in the cases of businesses which are still operating, essential businesses. And then moving into the remote workplace setting, protecting health and safety at home, what you can do to ensure the health and safety of your workers that are working at home. We've also been talking about travel, of course, and this was a big topic at the beginning. So restrictions on travel, what you can restrict in terms of business travel, personal travel, encouraging virtual meetings and remote working where it's possible, implementing self-quarantine guidelines and following government restrictions on that regard, and then using portals to track travel in terms of both personal and business travel. We've also been talking about the right for workers not to work in an unsafe workplace. So there is a general right under each piece of occupational health and safety that's in place for an employee to raise their hand and say, you know, I don't feel this is a safe workplace. And employers then have to deal with that, whether it be by conducting a workplace hazard assessment, working with their employee committees, workplace health and safety committees on dealing with that, and looking to see if there's appropriate personal protective equipment in place. And in some cases where the situation has been escalated, working with the applicable government occupational health and safety authority on dealing with that. Moving on to employment standards, we've been, it's actually just the former slide there. So employment standards, we've been dealing with questions around hours of work, break time, overtime pay, and overtime hours. So these things that arise, so employers still need to be conscious about complying with employment standards, notwithstanding that it may be a different workplace. So you may be dealing with employees who are working from home. And then leaves of absence. So there are various forms of job protected leaves of absence in each of the provinces. So illness leaves of absence, which may be applicable here, but there are also new leaves of absence that have been implemented in each of the provinces. For example, here in Alberta, we have a new COVID-related job protected leave of absence that may apply and that employers have been asking about. Moving on to union situations, so that would be an employment circumstance where you're dealing with a union, so labor considerations. We've been looking at the collective agreements, whether those agreements allow for the changes that the employer is looking to put in place. So management rights clauses, we've been looking at force majeure clauses and whether those will be applicable here. And we've also been looking at layoff and severance provisions, so whether they apply and ensuring compliance under the collective bargaining agreements. From a privacy perspective, COVID has raised interesting privacy questions and interesting privacy concerns. So under privacy legislation, an employer is only permitted to collect the information, personal information that's needed to accomplish their goals, their legitimate and reasonable goals. And so normally that would require a minimal amount of health and sensitive information that relates to an individual. But in the COVID situation, that perhaps may require more information than typically is allowed. So a diagnosis information or information relating to temperature. We've had some questions around taking temperatures of employees at remote work sites and that sort of thing. So interesting on that front. And then from a working from home front, we've also been advising on protecting and safeguarding confidential and business information at home, whether that be ensuring the remote setup is safe and that you know it's protected in terms of threats or hacks. And that you have appropriate IT measures in place and that you're also safeguarding confidential information at home, ensuring that policies are being followed in terms of protecting sensitive information and ensuring that shredding policies and retention policies are being followed. And then finally, from a human rights perspective, we're talking about ensuring that no policies relating to COVID are discriminating against someone because of their race or gender or place of origin. And so really need to be applying those in a fair and equal manner. And we're also talking about accommodation that may be necessary if someone has needs based on an illness or disability or family needs in terms of remote working and the fact that a lot of daycares and schools are closed and people may be dealing with family considerations while also working from home. So those are just generally some of the employment law issues we've been working on. And then just to go to the next slide, one of the big topics we've been talking about, and Alexis touched on this, is how employers can deal with the financial stresses and minimizing financial repercussions of this pandemic, but also try and minimize the impact on workers. So we've been answering a lot of questions about reduction of hours and compensation, which would normally lead to issues around constructive dismissal. But in this situation, we have been finding that more employers are going down the route of reducing hours and compensation, and that employees are more amenable to those kind of measures because they want to keep ties with their employers and they're looking to return to work as soon as possible. We've also been talking about layoffs, of course, and the rules around layoffs. So the rules vary by province, and we've been advising on the the timelines that apply to layoffs, which allow you to lay off and hit pause on employment without paying out severance entitlements, and then have the employee back to work within a certain amount of time. In Alberta here, the layoff timeline was 60 days, but has been extended to 120 days in the midst of the COVID crisis. So we've been advising about that, and of course we've been advising about terminations in some instances and severance calculations. And then finally, and Alexis touched on this, we've been advising on governmental support and whether that's available for both employers and employees in this situation. So whether they're at work and employers are, maybe looking at the temporary wage subsidy, or whether employees are laid off and employers may be looking at other kinds of options, such as the work sharing, the supplemental unemployment benefit program, which allows employers to lay off employees and but also top them up for a certain percentage of their salary, and it won't count against the employee's EI entitlements. So there are a variety of programs that are available to employers in this situation, and we're talking to employers about those measures. So I've given a lot of information. I'm conscious of the time, but that is what we've kind of been dealing with on the employment and privacy front.
Well, thank you so much, Birch, for that. And also thank you for jumping in. I gave you a lovely introduction, not recognizing my audio was not on. So thank you for jumping in and sharing with us. So we're going to move on to our next panelist, who is Lori Casselman. And Lori is the president and CRO of Wello. And she's a dynamic and innovative business leader with over 20 years leadership experience in the healthcare group. She's also been in group benefits and technology domains. So she has a wealth of experience holding a number of executive positions with Sun Life Financial and was Chief Health Officer at League. She is passionate about the power of partnership and enabling strategic alignment between startups and global enterprise organizations. She's also on a number of advisory boards, and we just look forward to hearing what she has to share with us today. So thanks, Lori, for stepping in.
Thanks so much, Wendy. So we wanted to take a moment just to turn our attention to the leadership perspective. So if you're an individual who is leading teams through these very unprecedented times, I think it's important to talk a little bit about both how you protect and manage your own health, and also how you continue to keep the employees and the teams that you lead engaged during these times. So first, I think it goes without saying that the COVID-19 crisis that we're living through really is like nothing that any of us as leaders have experienced before. Although many of us have lived through challenging times, I am sure. Living through a prolonged, invisible, global virus that forces us to self-protect with our families, in our homes, and causes significant economic upheaval, as well as significant health challenges globally, is certainly unique. And so I think first and foremost, it's important to recognize that, both for yourself and also amongst your teams and your colleagues. Trying to operate as though sort of business is as usual, I think is it's an unreasonable expectation to put on yourself. So I think just really recognizing the uniqueness of this time is really key. I think it's important to stay informed. And so I will say, from a personal perspective, I've really had to manage the amount of time that I spend following the media and updates. You can get really caught up in staying, attached to CNN and local media on a daily basis. I think it's important to compartmentalize those updates so that you're keeping yourself informed, but you're also able to operate in a healthy manner and lead your teams in a healthy manner. So Sean, if you can just jump to the next slide. Just want to share some perspective on some of the engagement strategies that we've been sharing with business leaders that we support, and also that we've been practicing ourselves within our own organization. So beyond my first point about staying informed, and I think that staying informed component really relates to how you bring your best self and your most informed self to your own teams, but also to the clients and colleagues that you're working with on a day-to-day basis. I think it's important to recognize that if you're working with clients, they may be in different industries that are being impacted in different ways. And also, depending on the size of the organization, it can also, this particular scenario can also be having more dramatic impacts, from an economic perspective on different industries. So being informed and also having that perspective and empathy for your clients and your teams is really key. So in terms of how you support your own employees or your own organization through these times, I think it's also incredibly important to stay connected. I'd say that's the number one thing that we are focused on doing within our own organization, is really communicating with our employees, communicating with each other on a more frequent basis. Just as an example, we do have weekly executive team meetings, and we're ensuring that we are consistent and sort of mandating ourselves to show up and really participate in those meetings. Also ensuring that we are having regular and probably more frequent meetings in most cases with our own teams, and leveraging all of the tools that we have at our disposal to do so. So whether that's, virtual webinars, which we are employing at a very frequent basis at this point, which I think most organizations are, or even conference calls, and really finding that opportunity to connect. I can share that within my own team, we've implemented a daily huddle. It's just a 15-minute touch point. We do it every morning. And I will say, for me personally, it's a great way to start the day, to really connect, and see the individuals on your team. Take a moment to share a story or really bring some levity into your day, which in many cases is, unusually hectic. And in many cases, for many of us, we're working extra hours as we work at home, particularly in high demand industries such as that we are in here at Wello, supporting unusually high demand for virtual care. In addition, I think getting creative around how you really implement new ways of connecting with your team. Just one example that we've seen within our own organization that I'll share as well, we've created a virtual meeting room where for a particular point of the day, usually a couple of hours in the afternoon, people can actually connect virtually and just do the work that they're doing, or be able to run scenarios by one another. If they're on the same team and they want to share creative ideas, I think this just creates an opportunity for connectivity that people are just so in need for in many cases. Something else I want to point out, I've been participating in a lot of webinars over the last few weeks and sharing strategies and tactics on engaging employees and supporting both organizational health, but also personal health. I think it's important to recognize that we are all uniquely working our way through this current state. So for many individuals, they're experiencing financial concerns, personal concerns. They may be supporting loved ones who have compromised immunity and are experiencing anxiety and fear in the current state. In many cases, there's individuals who are dealing with feelings of isolation. And so I think it's important that regardless of your personal scenario, and I'll talk for a minute about how you manage your own personal health, you're also, as a leader, bringing empathy into your one-on-ones and your management of other individuals on your team. Making sure you're asking questions around how they're doing, what their personal experience is, if they're comfortable sharing, and then being there to be an ear to listen or to provide ideas on supporting them through this challenging time. So I think bringing positivity and also appreciation of the work that they're doing and their current state and the environment that they're really working in on a day-to-day basis. I think it goes a tremendously long way for someone to feel like they're being heard right now, and also to feel like they're being appreciated and understood during these unusual times. And the last point I just want to spend a moment on is just around taking care of yourself. So I think to show up as our best leadership selves, we need to really make sure that we're protecting our own health and ensuring that we really take care of making sure that we're getting enough sleep, making sure that we're getting enough physical activity, paying attention to diet. It can become unusually sort of on routine or sort of outside of the routine to get in your daily meals and snacks when you're sort of in your own home and in your own office for a quite long period of time throughout the day. So just paying attention to setting a schedule, setting routine, making plans, and then really, taking a moment for yourself as well is really key to showing up as your best leadership self. So with that, I'm going to turn it over to Michelle to share some examples of how she's managing for our team and also some of the tactics that we're employing here at Live in Wello.
Well, thank you, Laurie. So our next panelist is Michelle McNutt, and as Laurie mentioned, she is our Wello and Live Director of People and Culture. Michelle has a Bachelor of Commerce in Marketing and HR, but most of her learning came from various roles over the years with Sobeys, Conroy Ross Partners, Suncor, MNP, and she's owned her own consulting practice. Originally from Nova Scotia, she found her way to Calgary and loved it and stayed, and we're glad for that. She's passionate about giving back and does lots of volunteer work with Special Olympics and a number of other organizations. So we're looking forward to, Michelle, to your input from an HR perspective.
Awesome. Thank you, Wendy. So I think from my perspective, it's really going to delve into a lot of the concepts that Laurie's been introducing around. There's some very general themes that we're trying to maintain and move forward. And I think the biggest piece, very much as Laurie said, is just the recognition that this isn't normal and that's okay. And so really the area in this time is communication. And so what are you communicating? When are you communicating? How are you communicating? So our strategy has been often, that has been kind of the way that we've gone through this. In terms of how we're sharing specific COVID-19 information, ensuring that it's fact-based, ensuring that it is a common thought. So, not sharing things that are theories or, maybe very introductory thoughts, but making sure we've got really good facts before we're bringing them forward to our staff and our clients. And I think, the piece that we were able to do, and probably the piece that gets me really excited, is we were able to shift from more of a logistical approach in our communication over to kind of a culture base. So at very first it was, how are we going to get staff remote? Do they have the right equipment? What platforms do they need access to? And now it's more around how are we taking care of ourselves? How are we taking care of each other? And how can we support that? So, in terms of what we've been able to shift to, that's been really exciting. We've developed a resource list of just things that are really amazing that are happening around the world now. Things that maybe we wouldn't otherwise get access to from a virtual perspective. So being able to watch an amazing concert from the comfort of your couch, being able to tour a UNESCO site, amazing museums and things like that are giving virtual tours. So lots of resources for kind of our staff and their families to be able to maybe shut off a little bit and not hear COVID related information. I think that part is really important. Obviously, we're doing webinars weekly, encouraging our staff to join in those and be part of the conversation. We're looking to start more of a town hall approach where any of our staff could join in and hear from our CEO, Vince, or hear from Laurie, myself, Wendy, and many of the rest of our executive team from that perspective as well. Probably the two biggest tools we've been using right in this time is Zoom, obviously, as we're on Zoom currently. And so from a Zoom perspective, we had been using Zoom prior to COVID-19. So luckily, a lot of our staff were already used to the platform. I think where we've evolved it is bringing back that normalcy of being in an office and working with each other. So we were able to create a lounge, and so essentially a virtual break room. Even today we had a couple of staff comment of, hey, at 11 p.m., Mountain Standard Time, I'm jumping in there to have my lunch if anybody wants to join. And in fact, that's actually presented an opportunity for us. We now have a connection point between, a nurse practitioner in New Brunswick connecting with one of our account executives in BC. And so I think it's actually giving us an opportunity to have more connection, although that seems funny and counterintuitive, but we're just giving more platforms and more opportunities for those conversations to happen, which I think is really exciting. We also have a sales bullpen. So typically the majority of our sales staff sit together in one office. And so they're used to hearing each other make their phone calls and hearing when something goes particularly well or giving advice when something maybe didn't go the way that they wanted. And so we've been able to create a virtual bullpen where they can just go in and be working together, even if they're not working on something collaboratively. Another tool that we use a lot is Slack. So really any instant messenger tool would do the same thing, but for us, it's been Slack. And it was something we were using prior to COVID-19 as well. But just kind of how the conversation might have shifted a little bit. So certainly from a non-work related perspective, we're meeting lots of new coworkers, people's pets and children and spouses. And so the acknowledgement that we're going to see someone kind of walk in behind, not realizing that someone's on a video call. And just we're seeing people's, at home setups, that how they're setting up their offices for now until we're back to whatever normal will look like in the go forward. So that's all been really interesting and really leveraging systems that we fortunately already had in place. One of the other pieces that we have done and we've tried to focus on in particular is our leaders. And so I think being a leader in any time is hard. It's definitely a challenge, but in a time like this, you're being looked at from a perspective of guidance and support and how are things moving forward. And so we have started some leader specific communication. So offering up, articles of interest, tips or tricks. But one of the main focuses with this group, as with our entire staff population, as Lori mentioned, is really around self-care. I'm sure our staff and particularly my team is probably getting tired of hearing you can't set yourself on fire to keep someone else warm. So making sure that we are focusing on the things that we can do for ourselves, getting enough sleep, eating the right things, getting workouts in, getting time with our families, whatever those pieces might be, to make sure that we are getting that opportunity to shut off and reset before coming back tomorrow and tackling the day. I think the other piece that we've tried to address as a leadership team as well is managing expectations. And so I think we've all, seen from a social perspective, the folks that are learning new languages and baking, every variety of bread that's possible. And some of those things are great. And if that's how one of your coping methods, amazing. And feel free to send some bread over to the rest of us who are not prepared to be upping our baking skills. But I think from the perspective of just what we can actually do and not setting ourselves up for failure. So let's set ourselves up for success in a way that, what are the things that we want to tackle today? So whether that is, I want to get outside for 20 minutes, I want to be reading a book, I want to have dinner with my family every evening, whatever those pieces are. So just making sure that we're really focusing from a leader perspective, because it is really important in a time like this to have, all of our staff have a good well-being, but I think in particular our leaders, because there's a lot coming their way. And then the last point probably sounds very counterintuitive, but maintaining routine where possible. So I don't think the what has to change. So the what being, team huddles and connection and conversation. It's just really the how. So as Lori mentioned, they used to have a huddle in the office every morning, and now that huddle is virtual. So how can we do things like that where we can still maintain those pieces that were really important to us? And if I think back, and if I look at us in particular at In Live in Wello, I'm fortunate to say we have a really great culture. And so that doesn't have to go away now that we're virtual. And so what are those things that make us great, and how do we keep those pieces going? So team huddles, we start every meeting with values stories, which essentially is just a story around how one of our teammates is presenting in a way that matches one of our core values. And for us, those values are team care, passion, and growth. We just put out a call for nominations for our Star of the Quarter and New Kid on the Block, something we would typically be doing. And because we're virtual doesn't actually mean that has to change. Team builders. I feel jealous when I find out that we've had, a team happy hour or a team coffee break together. I think those are fantastic. And as Lori mentioned, we actually did one with our executive team last week, where we didn't really talk about work. It was more around, how's everyone doing? How's everyone coping with this? How are your families? How are your friends? And kind of getting to know each other a little bit more. And funny enough, that conversation was supposed to be an hour or so, and we ended up being on there for a couple of hours, which is probably begs the question that it was very needed. And also from a perspective, like we're fortunate, one of our service offerings within our company is fitness. So we had been doing weekly circuit classes, and we get to continue doing those. They're just virtual now. We have access to a lot of great providers who have sent their services virtual. And so encouraging our staff to be able to use those pieces. Our staff at the clinic in particular tend to do a lot of decorating for holidays and a lot of celebrations. And so when the movement started around, putting hearts and thank you messages in windows of businesses and homes for the frontline workers, our team was no different. So if you happen to drive past our clinic in Calgary, you'll see that our windows are plastered with hearts and, really positive messaging and acknowledgement of thanks for all those who are working frontline and continue to work frontline during this. And then also just a reminder around, the services that we have. All of our employees do have benefits. They have obvious access to our virtual healthcare offering, Wello, their EFAP program. So drawing on those resources that they already have and continuing to use those. So I think, probably in a summation, the biggest piece is, remembering what makes you you. And so from all of the companies, I'm sure you've put a lot of thought into your culture and who you are and how you guys want to show up for both your staff and each other. And so nothing has to change from that regard. It's just how you're doing that. And I'll pull it over to Wendy for some questions.
Great. Well, thank you, everybody. Really incredible information, and I love the different perspectives that we've gone, from some of the government programs out there to help employers, to the employer business aspects of things, to how as leaders we manage in these times and with our businesses, and down to employees and culture and some of the things that come about within businesses. So we want to open it up to questions, and I'm sure a lot of you that are participating may have some questions that have come up. Some have sent them in ahead of time, but feel free to continue sending in your questions, and we'll try and get them all answered. So first question, I'm not sure, I'll just throw it out and see who feels best appropriate to answer it. So obviously we have a lot of staff now working at home, but I don't know if my staff is working when they're at home. How do I handle that or monitor that?
I could definitely take this one. I mean, I think the piece of it really being around, how do you know they're working when they're in your office? So I think there's an element of trust that comes with the fact that the folks that you've already hired, but also plan some check-ins. For our team, we do check in. And so we have a sense of, in the morning, if we don't have a huddle, we'll put in what our daily focuses are for the day. So, my team knows what I'm focused on and I know what they're focused on. And so if the next day those things are maybe still on the list, like let's have a conversation about maybe why they weren't achieved the day before, or how else we can support to get some of those things off our to-do list. So I think that the biggest piece is communication, which I don't think is any different than when you're in your environment either.
Absolutely.
Yeah, and I can speak to this one a little bit as well. It's not really a legal answer so much as it is a process answer that we've implemented with our own teams, but we have put more technology in place so that we have communication and information about who's busy and who's not. What we were finding is that it's a little bit lumpy. You get people who are extremely busy and people who have a little more time than they usually do. And even a simple thing like asking folks at the end of each day to just send a note to a team leader saying, I have time to take on more, or I have too much to do, it has been a really helpful stopgap while we get some of this technology up and running. And as I say, more information allows us to smooth the work out so that nobody's too busy and nobody's sitting around doing nothing.
Great. I think this one more likely goes to you, Birch, but can I change people's work duties during COVID-19?
So, and this goes back to something I mentioned, which is constructive dismissal. So at law, if you make a fundamental change to someone's terms and conditions of employment, they're entitled to raise their hand and say, I feel that my terms and conditions have been fundamentally changed, and in that regard, I'm entitled to resign and sue for severance entitlement. And that would be the normal course if there's been a fundamental change. And we typically do an analysis of what is a fundamental change. So whether that be a large compensation change of typically more than 10%, whether that be a loss in prestige or title where you're demoting someone or taking away reports. But all that being said, this situation has made for a different kind of analysis, because we are advising with employers, and we're talking with employers about the fact that if you're implementing a temporary change and it's communicated as temporary, that may not trigger constructive dismissal in this situation, because the situation calls for changes and needed changes. So not only will it perhaps not trigger a constructive dismissal, but employees are more open and amenable to changes in this environment because they are being communicated as temporary, because they are seen as necessary. So I guess the shorter answer is, I think there's more opportunity to change duties in this environment than in the normal environment.
Great, thank you. I think there may be a little bit of confusion regarding some of the government and staff wage subsidies, et cetera. I'm going to throw this one to you, Alexis. Somebody has asked, where can I direct staff to get the salary wage subsidy?
So the wage subsidy isn't for your staff, it's the business that applies for it, and they apply for it based on their financial revenues, and it subsidizes the salaries that are being paid to staff. You cannot obtain the wage subsidy for salaries that are not being paid, with the asterisk being, in some cases, and subject to the employment law issues, we are aware that employers are able to reduce the salaries they're paying to that 75% level or to something less than 100%, but still obtain 75% on the original salary. So that doesn't relieve you of the employment law obligations, but it does mean you can get that subsidy. But it's the business that applies for it, and it's the business revenues that are driven by it. If you're laying off staff, they're looking at the Canada Emergency Response Benefit or expanded employment insurance availability, as well as some of the other measures that are available for individuals.
Thank you. And this is certainly a question that we've had posed to us as well, but so we're asking employees now to work at home, and some of them may not have a real setup for that, that a private office or an area where they can work. So does the employer need to buy home office equipment for staff who are now having to work at home? Maybe that's you, Birch.
Yeah, so there is no legal requirement to buy supplies, but I think practically speaking, if you want to ensure your employees are working and you want to ensure business continuity, you may be faced with an employee who says, okay, that's great, you want me to work at home, but I don't have the resources for that. And you're going to be hard pressed to terminate for cause on that basis, right? So you're faced with, okay, do I want my employees to work at home or do I not in that situation? But at the end of the day, I think you just need to enter into a discussion, and this is more from the HR side of things, with the employees. Okay, how can we get this done? What do you need? How can we support you in this? And then look at finances to see if it's available.
Great. This one is a little more general, and you can certainly hear the tone coming out, and many businesses are really struggling right now. So a question, how can businesses survive in these unique and difficult times? Lori, do you want to take a crack at that?
Well, I think it's a pretty big question. I'm happy to share some perspective, but it really depends on the business, and it depends on, sort of the stability of the business long term. So I would say, again, it's incredibly important to stay informed, to really look closely at your business financials, to really be decisive in terms of, protecting your budget and protecting, any kind of runway that you have within your business by making changes that are not necessarily impacting in a significant way your business viability. A lot of organizations have had to make cuts to their labor force, and although those are incredibly difficult, again, I think it's important to really understand the supports that are being put in place in many cases on a day-to-day basis through our government, and then looking for opportunities to leverage those resources to ensure that, you do have that viability longer term. But also, I would just say being really disciplined around, making tough decisions around cutting non-essential aspects of your business in a timely fashion.
I might add a couple of thoughts. The first is, I really would encourage folks to talk to their financial institution, particularly in Canada. We are seeing financial institutions with a suite of tools available to them to try and help folks. That doesn't mean they're going to be able to solve every problem, but it does mean that between the wage subsidy programs, the tax deferrals, and the liquidity programs, the vast majority of businesses that were viable a month ago should be able to, with leverage and some of these support programs, navigate this so that they come out of it as a going concern. There are going to be exceptions to that, and there are going to be gaps in these programs. And one thing you can also consider doing is calling your member of parliament or your provincial elected officials and asking them for help. They are working hard to help the businesses in their ridings and in their communities. They're not going to have solutions all the time either, but they will be able to help. The other place to look is the regional economic development offices, whether it's FedNor or depending on what jurisdiction you're in. Government of Canada has regional economic development offices across the country for your jurisdiction, and they are in a position to help folks navigate what's available. We covered on this call just a few of the highlights, but as I say, there are hundreds of measures being put in place between individuals and businesses, and there's lots to look to there. And then the last thing I would say is be creative and consider whether some of these priority procurement programs or other circumstances may provide alternate revenue opportunities for your business. Are there other ways to take the expertise that you have and the tools that you have and generate revenue, particularly serving needs that may not have existed at the level they do a month ago?
Great thoughts there. Another one regarding more employment law. Does an employee have the ability to say no to an offer of a temporary layoff? And further to the above, if they do say no and ask to see a severance package instead, how do you handle that?
Okay, so depending on the jurisdiction you as an employer are governed by, there's different temporary layoff rules. But as long as you're following those rules, it's a layoff. So it's a temporary layoff. It is not a termination if it's within the time period prescribed by those rules. The only recourse for an employee is to claim constructive dismissal, which is the fundamental change that I spoke about. But the employee is going to have to take a couple risks in doing so. They're going to have to quit their job and claim constructive dismissal, and so lose their job. And they're also going to have to take the risk that perhaps this measure, this layoff, isn't actually deemed down the road by a court to be a constructive dismissal, entitling them to severance. So the court will actually decide, okay, we actually see that as a resignation and you're not entitled to severance entitlement. So the answer to the question is no. An employee cannot say, I refuse this layoff, show me the severance. The only recourse is to do the constructive dismissal route.
Great, thank you. Another question, sort of just to clarify. So you said if they do get a layoff, they are not entitled to a severance, is that correct?
Right. So a layoff is, I like to characterize it as hitting the pause button on employment. So someone is still an employee. They are not terminated. They are not severed. They are paused. And if you call them back within the prescribed time period, all goes on and employment continues. It's if you don't call them back within the prescribed time period that there is a deemed termination of employment, and at that time, severance entitlements are owed.
Right.
There's a common misconception that a layoff is actually a termination without cause, and that's not actually the case. At law, a layoff is what I've described, a temporary pause on employment.
Great, thank you. And just one final question. I'm not sure if this should be Alexis or somebody else, but we've heard with the CERB that they have to have zero income. What about the employees or people that are in business that they can still provide some service, but it's certainly not to the same level at that employer level or contractor level? Is there any recourse for them? Whoops, I think you're muted there, Alexis.
Sorry about that. I was
Yeah.
looking at Birch to see if she might want to add something on this as well. It's a difficult question. We have seen reports that people who are applying for the CERB are being approved automatically, and that if it then subsequently turns out that they were ineligible, that clawback will come with their taxes next year. I can't speak to directly whether that's correct or not, and at the moment it does appear that any income is making folks ineligible for CERB, and there's certainly some controversy and discussion around that. I guess if those reports are true, it effectively turns the CERB into a bit of a loan if you're in reduced income. It does seem a little bit like an unintended consequence if you're making $150 a week from your previous source of employment and can't collect the $2,000 a month CERB. But that is my understanding of the benefit. It isn't an area that we spend a lot of time focusing on in terms of businesses, so I don't want to overstate our confidence on that answer.
Yeah, I would just add, I don't know the answer off the top of my head. I think Alexis is probably right, unfortunately, but again, I would add that things are changing every day. And, you know, something that we've said yesterday actually changes tomorrow, and the government is issuing new rules as, you know, issues come up. And I think that is one of the issues that's been raised. So I think we'll see if the rules change on that front.
I think one final quick set, I hope it's a quick question. Somebody said, if I let staff go, can I rehire staff at a lower salary?
So if you've actually terminated employment and satisfied your termination and severance entitlements, you can absolutely rehire based on new terms and conditions, and that could be a lesser salary. It's if you're dealing with a different situation, for example, a temporary layoff, where you just have hit the pause button and then you have them back at work. If you actually are changing terms and conditions of employment, like a lower salary, you may be dealing with that constructive dismissal claim at that time, because while employees are willing to have changes to their terms and conditions, perhaps temporarily, they may not be so willing if it's a permanent state of affairs.
Well, I would truly like to thank each and every one of you. It's been incredible information that's been shared today. It's big topics, and I know big information that's been put out there, but I think everybody who's participated will have found this incredibly valuable, informative, and took away some practical tips. So thank you all. We're going to be continuing our webinar series every Tuesday, and to help everyone through these times cope with COVID. And next week, we'll be doing a focus more again on nutrition and fitness during these times. I also just want to put a reminder out that we know everybody's in this together, and we really want to encourage a community of sharing some positives through this time. So please go to #WelloCommunity and share any positive images, thoughts, ideas you've come up with, you know, your workspace ideas at home, whatever you'd like to share, but we'd like to keep it a positive forum. And just a reminder for everybody to stay healthy, stay safe, and remember just how important it is, everybody's actions in following our public health advisory, because we each do make a difference. So we'll look forward to meeting again next week. Thanks so much.